And as I said a minute ago, my name is Dr. Matthew J. Hernando. I'm the lead history and humanities instructor here at CCC. And I am not a Shakespeare expert, still less am I an expert in medieval Japan. Both of those are rich disciplines with literally hundreds of scholars, thousands in the case of Shakespeare, who have made meaningful contributions to the literature on those topics. I'll be up front with you right now, I'm not one of them. But what I am is a 12-year veteran of community college education, which I like to think of as kind of its own superpower. And one of the things that you learn as a community college instructor is how to find interesting connections between diverse subject matter that can stimulate good classroom discussion and stimulate insightful questions from students. So the basic purpose of this lecture is to tell the story of how modern commercial theater, by commercial I mean business, right, arose in two very different places at almost the same time. And those two places were Elizabethan England and Tokugawa, Japan. And I should also stipulate that this Comet Talk originated in lecture material that I crafted for my Humanities 241 class. In addition to teaching all of the history classes here at CCC, I also teach 2 humanities survey classes. And basically, one of the things that I try to do in my humanities classes is to get students to make connections between art and literature, art, literature, philosophy, religion, the humanities, as we like to refer to them, because they all involve expressing what it means to be human, and then history, which is my primary field, history. How is history reflected in art and literature? How does art and literature reflect the values, the attitudes, and the beliefs of the societies that create it? Right. So that's one of the main goals that I try to accomplish. Actually, one of my learning objectives that I try to accomplish in my humanities class. The underlying argument that I'm going to be trying to make here in this lecture, the underlying thesis that I'm going to be trying to advance, is that although outwardly very different, anybody here who has watched Kabuki theater and Shakespearean theater know they don't look a lot alike, right? These two varieties of theater actually share a number of easy to miss similarities, both in terms of the content offered, literally the type of plays being written, and also the theatrical techniques used to deliver them to audiences, the physical settings, i.e. the theaters in which they were performed, and also the actors who performed these plays. Moreover, these similarities between Shakespearean and Kabuki theater exist because at this time, English and Japanese societies, while outwardly very different, were developing in ways that in many ways were subtly parallel to one another. They were going through the same kind of historical, social processes of development at this time. But before I can get to that, I want to give you a brief overview of the history of theater as a whole to set the stage. This should take only about 15 minutes. Those of you who study theater professionally know this is going to be like very 10,000 feet view of this topic. I suspect those of you who study theater professionally know where theater originates, right? Everybody probably knows that. Much of the conventions of modern theater as we know it originate in ancient Greece. Greece theater kind of begins as a separate art form with the ancient Greeks, starting around the 6th century BCE, who pioneered many of the basic features of the art form, including 2 of its most enduring genres. Now, I have a couple of people here who study theater professionally. So what are the 2 basic genres of theater that the Greeks invent? Tragedy and comedy. There you go. That's exactly right. Tragedy and comedy. And if I had more time and go into some of the differences between those two genres. Obviously, the story doesn't end there. Since the Greeks, many people groups around the world have developed their own theatrical traditions, sometimes independent of one another, and sometimes with significant inputs from other cultures. Romans, for example. Romans learned about theater from the Greeks and copied many of the conventions of Greek theater while adapting them to their own use. Although the historian Livy suggests that there were troops of Etruscan actors who may have been staging dramatic performances as early as the 4th century BCE, it wasn't until the 3rd century, when Rome began expanding into traditionally Greek territory in the Balkans, that Roman theater really began to take off. The first significant Roman playwright was a guy named Livius Andronicus. Livius Andronicus, who began producing tragedies and comedies around 240 BCE, followed by Naevius a few years later. Sadly, neither writer produced any works that survive to this day. Among Roman dramatists and audiences, comedy appears to have been more important than tragedy, which is the reverse of Greece. In ancient Greece, tragedy was more important than comedy as a whole. And the Greek influence on Roman theater can be seen in the fact that most surviving Roman comedies are what were called fabula palliata, comedic plays based on Greek subjects. The earliest surviving examples of Roman tragedy come from the Stoic philosopher Seneca. Many of these are fabula crepidata, which are Roman tragedies based on Greek subjects. So one example of this from Seneca is Agamemnon. Agamemnon tells the story of the Greek king who basically led the Greek armies in the Trojan War, only to come back home victorious and be promptly murdered by his wife, because he had sacrificed their daughter in order to appease Poseidon so they could make a trip across the Aegean. Turned out his wife didn't appreciate that, so she has him killed. So after Roman theater, then we need to talk about Chinese theater. There are some references in ancient texts to theatrical performances, apparently involving clowning and acrobatic routines being staged in China as early as the Shang Dynasty, around 1500 BCE or so, which would have actually predated Greek theater. But it's not until the Han Dynasty, which begins around 200 BCE or so, that we have clear evidence of a fully developed genre of theater being performed throughout China, which in this case was shadow puppetry, which precedes actually human performances. And it's not until much later that we see dramatic performances with actual human actors becoming a regular feature of popular entertainment in China. In India, a form of theater developed called Sanskrit theater. Sanskrit is the language spoken by ancient residents of the subcontinent. The clearest evidence for this is an instructional manual, and I'm going to butcher the name, apologies for any Sanskrit experts in the audience, but not Shastra. It translates roughly to a treatise on theater. And it was basically an instructional manual, a how-to manual, including topics like stage design and makeup and music and dance. A lot of it was on music and dance. But the earliest examples of Sanskrit theater, actual plays, don't come about until around the 1st century BCE. And then medieval theater. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, organized theatrical activities in Western Europe seemed to have largely disappeared. One area where drama of a sort does seem to have survived was in the Christian church, where occasionally small-scale theatrical performances occurred, typically based on stories from the Bible, on the lives of saints, and other religious subject matter. So think, those cutesy kids' Christmas specials with, the kids coming in with the donkeys and the sheep, and usually some old guy who got drafted old guys who got drafted for the purpose playing the wise men, that sort of thing. All right. A good example of this might be Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, which is kind of like a nun, but not exactly, from northern Germany, who wrote a series of religious plays based on the lives of saints and other religious topics. And she's often regarded as the first female playwright in European, possibly world history. Okay, so that was my motoring through the history of early theater in about 10 minutes to get to the subject matter that you all came to hear about. Okay. In the history of theater, a key transitional period appears to have occurred around the late 16th to the early 17th century CE, during which certain key changes began to be seen. So one of those changes was the emergence of theaters, distinct purpose-built structures created specifically for the purpose of housing theatrical performances. So theaters begin to emerge as a new form of architecture. Also, the theater seems to have come into its own during this time period as a form of commercial activity. In other words, literally a business, something that people made a living from which actors, playwrights, theater owners especially, could derive a regular income. But one of the more remarkable things about the history of theater is that we see a lot of these changes occurring at almost exactly the same time in two very different historical and cultural contexts on opposite sides of the world. And they are Elizabethan England and Tokugawa Japan. So if we look at England and Japan during this period, what did these two societies have in common that might have contributed to the rise of commercial theater within them? I would argue with you, if you look at the broad scope of English and Japanese history during this period, there are at least three characteristics that stand out. Now, one of them is not historical and it's geographical. And that is the fact that, as the slide suggests, both England and Japan are island nations, right? They're island nations. What does, and some of you have lived in Japan. Has anybody here lived in England? I haven't lived in either place. I've visited Japan, but very briefly. But I had my grandmother grew up in Scotland/England. What does being an island nation give to both of those societies? What do you think? A hothouse atmosphere where things can develop without judgment from other countries. So there's a degree of isolation, right? Okay, that's one thing, absolutely. I would agree with that. What else? There's a greater degree of homogeneity in the population. That's absolutely true. Not so much for either of these societies today, but definitely back in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were very ethnically and culturally homogeneous, and ethnically and culturally homogeneous and also somewhat geographically isolated societies also tend to develop what type of attitudes towards outsiders? Huh? Sometimes hostility, xenophobia. What else? Xenophobia, hostility, but also maybe a bit of a superiority complex, possibly as well. I can tell you that's definitely true in the case of Britain, the English. The English, you know, one of my favorite British comedians said in the wake of Brexit that Brexit was totally predictable because if there's one intrinsic enduring character to the British mindset, the British culture, it's the desire to tell Europe to go blank itself, right? And if you look at the history of Japan, xenophobia runs deep. It's like a deeply embedded cultural characteristic. We're going to talk about that in connection with Tokugawa Japan. in just a bit. Also, both of these are island nations that are adjacent to much larger zones of cultural and economic and political activity that in some cases have the potential to overshadow or even overwhelm them. Now, in the case of Japan, that would be who? China, obviously, right? And in the case of England, that would be Europe, France/Europe as a whole, right? And so there's kind of a superiority and inferiority complex that develops as a result of that. The British and Japanese people definitely feel themselves to be separate, distinct from their neighbors, maybe superior to them in some ways. But on the other hand, they look across this fairly narrow body of water, and there's a big, vast world out there that they know is a lot bigger than them. And in many ways, they've often been confronted by rivals or adversaries who have a lot more power than them and potentially even have the ability to overwhelm and overrun them, which has happened a number of times in the history of both countries. They faced adversaries from across the continent that have attempted to overwhelm and overrun them. So there's a bit of a superiority and inferiority complex going on at the same time in both countries. All right. So their characteristics as island nations is very important to keep in mind. Also, another similarity between both Elizabethan England and Tokugawa Japan is that both nations were enjoying periods of relative peace and stability and prosperity that followed periods of heightened turmoil, social turmoil, and political conflict, and frankly, violence. So in the case of Elizabethan England, and my Shakespeare experts here will know that, it was the War of the Roses, right? Elizabethan England follows not long after the War of the Roses. War of the Roses was about a 70-year-long period of internecine strife within England that culminated when Henry VII, the grandfather of Elizabeth I, won the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, effectively ending that decades-long dynastic conflict over basically control of the English crown. The Tudor monarchy, so Elizabeth I is a Tudor. As I said, she's the granddaughter of Henry VII, daughter of Henry VIII. And if that doesn't give you a complex, I don't know what will, being the daughter of Henry VIII. Having your father execute your mother, I'm sure all kinds of deep-rooted senses of insecurity on her part. But so the Tudor period is a period of relative stability, but it follows one of heightened social turmoil and chaos and disruption and violence and so on. And even the early Tudor monarchy, was a little bit chaotic. If you remember Henry VIII, not only does he have a penchant for running through wives, like some people change, suits of clothes, but also he takes England out of the Catholic Church, declares himself the supreme head of the Church of England, so basically forces England to join the Protestant camp. And that leads to decades of religious tension and frequent violence between Protestants and Catholics as England swung from the rule of Henry's ultra-Protestant son, Edward VI, to his Catholic daughter, Mary Tudor, aka Bloody Mary, because she liked to burn Protestants at the stake. And then back again to the Protestant camp with Elizabeth I. So it goes from Protestant to ultra-Protestant to extreme revanchist Catholic to Protestant again. And then Elizabeth I kind of, I don't want to go too far into the weeds into the English Reformation here, but she kind of casts herself as a moderate Protestant. She maintains a lot of the old elements of the Catholic worship rituals and teachings and so on, but gives them kind of a Protestant gloss or patina. So England during Elizabeth's reign was very much kind of catching its breath so to speak, after a period of incredible turmoil and instability. And likewise, Japan, around the beginning of the 17th century, was entering what would be a fairly long period of peace, stability, and prosperity that followed one of turmoil and instability. In 1600, Tokugawa Japan, also known as Edo, those of you who lived in Japan, probably the term Edo Japan is a little bit more familiar to you. Who is the guy who ushers in the era of Edo or Tokugawa Japan? Anybody? Ieyasu, there you go. Tokugawa Ieyasu, right? Who becomes the first shogun. He's not the emperor, he's the shogun, basically military dictator, for lack of a better way of describing it, of Tokugawa Japan. He defeats his rivals at the Battle of Sekigahara, laying the foundations of a political dynasty that would become known as either Edo Japan or the Tokugawa shogunate, that would govern Japan for basically 300 years, all the way into the mid 19th century. Before that, however, Japan had been racked by more than a century-long period of dissension and civil strife known as the era of Sengoku. The era of Sengoku, which literally translates to something like the country at war or the warring states period. And if you know anything about the history of Japan, it's basically a period where a bunch of regional daimyos, who are like regional nobility or lords, competed for control. But really what they're competing for control of is the emperor and the imperial family, because whoever could kind of capture the emperor could then kind of call the shots, because the emperor was basically a figurehead, always had been. They're competing for control of the emperor and also of the Japanese government. So Japan too is kind of catching its breath in the Tokugawa period. So in hindsight, the peace and stability of the Elizabethan and Tokugawa periods seems to have offered the people in England and Japan, respectively, the time and space, the breathing needed for a flourishing of the arts and literature. And at the same time, the turbulence of their recent past, all the violence and bloodshed and political machinations and intrigue, well, for dramatists, for playwrights, that becomes what? Great stories. It becomes a wonderful source material. It's wonderful source material to explore. Lastly, urban affluence. Both Elizabethan England and Tokugawa Japan were societies entering prolonged periods of urbanization, in which their major cities, which would be Edo/Tokyo for Japan and London for England, were going on basically a growing binge. They were getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. By the end of the 17th century, London's population would grow from around 200,000 at the beginning of the century to 600,000. Basically triples over the period of 100 years. Edo's population grows even more dramatically. Edo is the capital. Edo or Tokyo is the capital of Tokugawa Japan. At the beginning of the century, it had maybe 100,000 people. By 1700, it has 1 million inhabitants. It's one of the largest cities in the world. 1 million inhabitants back in 1700, right? So these are two of the largest cities in the world, and there are also regional metropolitan centers around the country as well. And within these growing metropolises, there arose a new group of people. They go by different names depending on where you are. If you're in a French-speaking country, they call them bourgeoisie. If you're in a German-speaking country, they call them burghers. But here in America, we call them what? Middle class. We typically refer to them as middle class, right? And in this context, it would include people like merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, other types of business people. One key distinction. When we use the term middle class today, here in 21st century US, and also to some degree over in Europe today as well, we're usually referring to people who are mid-level in what? Wealth or income. That's not the way the term middle class was used back in either of these places, okay? Middle class meant that you weren't a peasant, so you weren't living out and working in the countryside, tilling the soil with grandpa's femur, all right? But you also weren't a lord. You also weren't a lord. You didn't own a vast tract of land and have a title after your name. You were literally middle class. The emergence of this urban middle class creates a sense of social inversion in both societies. As formerly powerful elements of society become less powerful, the regional daimyos in Japan, the lords and ladies in Elizabethan England, they're becoming less powerful, in part because they're confronted with increasingly powerful centralized authority, which would be the Tudor monarchy in England and the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. Both of those power centers are gathering more power and more resources into their hands, and they're marginalizing the aristocracy. And at the same time, they're also facing a lot of pressure from below in the form of the middle class, because the middle class, well, they include a lot of people who are relatively modest in income and wealth and so on, but they also include a lot of people like lawyers and bankers and engineers and merchants, some people who become incredibly wealthy, incredibly economically powerful. So there's a good deal of social, you could say social mobility occurring in both places, as formerly unpowerful groups are becoming more powerful and formerly less powerful groups are becoming, formerly more powerful groups are becoming less powerful. And for our purposes, perhaps the most significant fact associated with the rise of the middle class is that it also helped to create a customer base for the purveyors of new forms of popular entertainment, including the theater, right? The middle class in both societies becomes the customer base. Okay. No, not terribly, but you know, if you're a peasant, you know, working, you know, in a rice paddy in Japan, or you know, working a 50-hectare plot in Elizabethan England, you probably don't have a lot of discretionary income to spend on any form of popular entertainment, right? Whereas middle-class people would. So, given the but that's a great question, though. Given the similarities in social conditions between England and Japan at this time, it's perhaps unsurprising that the history of theater in both countries would exhibit a number of startling areas of overlap. And some of the big ones that stand out to me include, well, number one, theater location. In Tokugawa, Japan, theaters were part of a broad category of business establishments in major urban areas that were called ukiyo, which translates roughly to something like floating worlds. Now, they included theaters, of course, but they also included other forms of entertainment or recreational venues, including, well, what would be one of the most common ones in Japan? So, yeah, geisha shows, okay, sure. Also tea houses, public baths, and, oh, yes, brothels, which are common in both societies. And because they all purveyed a similar type of services, they tended to be located in the same parts of the city. In Edo, for example, most of the ukiyo, the floating worlds, could be found in the Yoshiwara, which is a red light district of the city that basically the shogunate cordoned off and said that's where the floating worlds will be, right? So that to keep it out of sight, out of mind for the more respectable elements of society. And likewise, in Elizabethan London, most theaters tended to be located on the outskirts of the city, very often on the south bank of the River Thames, out of concern for fire, also to avoid spreading disease. because theaters are great places to catch communicable diseases, because you have people jammed in close to one another. And because the theater was associated with immoral activities like prostitution, that the church and state wanted to, again, also kind of keep out of eyeshot. Actually, let me keep this one up for just a second here. Another shared emphasis of both Kabuki theater and Shakespearean theater is that both recognize the need for innovative stage designs that allowed for a greater sense of connectedness between the audience and actors, to help the audience to kind of feel like they're almost a part of the action. And the stage setups that they created were designed to achieve that purpose. So in Kabuki theater, for example, this connection was achieved through the use of trapdoors, revolving stages that enabled actors to get into and out of the foreground very easily. Also the use of, and my folks who've lived in Japan here, what is this walkway called? It's Hanamichi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm getting it right. Okay, Hanamichi. They're footbridges that allow the actors to literally walk into the audience as they're acting out different scenes. Again, giving the audience a sense of greater connectivity to what is going on, feeling like they're a part of the action. In Elizabethan theater, the same sense of intimacy between plays, between the player and the players and the audience was achieved by building their theaters according to a circular or semicircular floor plan, with the stage extending into an open space in the middle of the structure, benches for the audience located all around. In modern times, we will call this setup what? Theater in the round. Yeah, there you go. Theater in the round. The classic example of this, of course, is the Globe Theater, built in London. This was Shakespeare's theater in London in 1599 by a theater company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, whose main playwright was none other than William Shakespeare. Another key similarity, all male actors. All male actors. And this is kind of a curious facet of both Shakespearean and Kabuki theater. And in both cases, it stemmed from the same basic cause, government regulation. Government regulation on behalf of public morality. In Elizabethan England, and also late medieval Europe more broadly, women were banned from acting in public theater performances out of a concern for public morality. Female actors were associated with sexual lasciviousness, prostitution, and many of them were prostitutes, so that was part of the reason for it, and also other forms of indecency. The ban in England on female actors was lifted in 1661, but that was nearly 50 years after Shakespeare's death. But even then, the social strictures against female roles were usually kept to a minimum. The social strictures against female roles continued to make acting a predominantly male profession for a long, long time thereafter. And female roles, because of that, because acting was still a male-dominated profession, female roles were usually kept to a minimum. Out of 981 characters in all of Shakespeare's plays, only 155, or 16%, are women. And those of you who've studied Shakespeare know women are usually given fairly minimal amounts of dialogue. There's a few exceptions to that. Yes?
Just a note on that, we're going to the I was telling us that the original Kabuki actors were all female.
So I'm going to get to that. Put a pin in that because you're right, but then it changes pretty quickly. You're absolutely right, but it changes pretty quickly. In Tokugawa, Japan, by contrast, Kabuki theater actually started out as our, sorry, what was your name again? As Bob was pointing out, it actually started out at the very beginning with all female acting troupes. But these were quickly banned by the shogunate very early on in the Tokugawa period, leading to acting becoming once again an all-male profession, as in England and most of Europe. And again, much of the concerns were the same. Acting was associated with prostitution, and indeed, both male and female actors often did sex work on the side, as basically a side hustle. And so it wasn't considered an occupation for decent Japanese women to participate in. And sidebar, in Japan, this led to the creation of a special category of actors called onagata, which are male actors that specialized in female roles. And they're still around today in Kabuki theater, very much. Male actors who only play female roles and have gotten very, very good at it through the use of hair and makeup over the years. I don't actually have it in my notes. My Shakespeare experts, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in Shakespearean theater, this male actors performing female roles, it was called taking the woman's part, right? Was that the phrase that was used? Don't know? Okay. Maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm misremembering. But anyways, also in Shakespearean theater, male actors pretty much portrayed all female roles up until, yeah, again, the ban was lifted in 1661. Now let's talk about dramatic content and themes. Both Kabuki theater and Shakespearean theater drew heavily on history for a lot of the subject matter conveyed in their plays. One key difference is that whereas Kabuki playwrights usually shied away from using Japanese history as the subject matter of their plays, in Shakespearean theater, they do not. In Shakespeare's play, a lot of Shakespeare's plays focus on major episodes from English history. And there's a variety of reasons for that, including much tighter press censorship. In Japan, playwrights are a lot more reluctant to say anything about Japanese history that might be misconstrued by the government. But not that that sort of thing couldn't get you in trouble in Elizabethan England as well. So instead, Japanese playwrights use Chinese history as their subject matter, but very often the way they'll portray it, they're making kind of subtle allusions to things going on in Japanese history as well. So for example, Chikamatsu Monzaemon, who is as close to the Japanese Shakespeare as anybody is, one of his famous plays is The Battles of Koxinga, probably the most popular history play in early Kabuki theater, and it's a heroic epic set during the Ming dynasty, in China. But there are subtle allusions to the founding of the Tokugawa dynasty there in that play. And Shakespearean theater, as I said, does not hesitate to discuss English history. So, for example, Shakespeare has Richard III, Henry V, Henry VI, Henry VIII. And a lot of his plays celebrate the glories of England's past or the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, but they also ask important questions about the nature of power, the corruptibility of rulers, and so on. Kabuki theater, according to some of the experts on it that I've read, it's also less likely to dwell on the interior lives of their characters, including their psychology and motivations. But I'm not enough of a Kabuki expert to be able to say that independently. The people who've studied Kabuki professionally say that. Shakespearean theater obviously much more likely to do so. One thematic similarity between Shakespearean and Kabuki theater that's impossible to ignore is the popularity of love-suicide stories. Love-suicide stories as a recurring theme. So in Shakespearean theater, the most obvious example of this is the most famous play that William Shakespeare ever wrote, Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet, the timeless story of two star-crossed lovers doomed by their forbidden love for one another. Less well known is the fact that 5 other women in Shakespeare's plays also kill themselves, and sometimes in ways that are subtly similar to what's going on in Romeo and Juliet. To give you a brief rundown, Shakespeare's women are always killing themselves. It's a thing. Portia, key character in Julius Caesar, kills herself because she misses her husband Brutus so much, and also because he neglects to follow her advice. Ophelia in Hamlet kills herself, according to some interpretations, because she's driven mad by her love for Hamlet, who also treats her like dirt. Cleopatra in Antony and Cleopatra kills herself in a fit of grief over Antony's suicide. Antony commits suicide because he mistakenly heard that Cleopatra had committed suicide. And then she kills herself because he does commit suicide, but also because she doesn't want to be paraded through the streets of Rome by Octavian as a trophy of war, which is totally reasonable motivation, in my opinion. Goneril in King Lear and Lady Macbeth, who both kill themselves out of motives unrelated to love. Meanwhile, love-suicide stories become so popular in Japan that they actually became a separate subgenre of Kabuki theater. A good example of this is the love-suicides at Sonsekai by Chikamatsu Monzaemon. Features a young man from humble circumstances who falls in love with an upper-class woman. The two wish to marry, but their families get in the way, leading the two to eventually commit suicide. And this play became so popular that many blamed it for a rash of double suicides among young, supposedly in the year after it was released, there were 17 young couples who commit, I can't independently verify that, but that's what was written at the time, who commit suicide in Edo. And so the shogunate bans its performance for a period of time to keep all the young star-crossed lovers from killing themselves. Which brings me to the first of my discussion questions that I want to pose to you all.